So on the line right now, the panel, we have Solomon Asamoah, who is the Chief Executive Officer and CEO rather, of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund. Who's waving there. Hopefully you can all see him. Solomon,
yeah.
there you go. Solomon was the former Vice President of the African Development Bank and also headed up the African Finance Corporation Infrastructure Fund out of Nigeria. We also have Solomon, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. I think everyone's on mute, Eamon, but I'm sure they've noted you.
Thanks a lot, Solomon, for your efforts.
Okay. We also have Robin Good from the Telkom Pension Fund in South Africa.
Hello, everybody.
Okay. Hi. We have Matiza, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Erskine Provident Pension Fund from South Africa.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thanks,
Good.
Hubert.
You're welcome, Linda. We have David Nyoma, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Pension Fund, Government Institutions Pension Fund of Namibia.
Hello, hi, everyone.
We have Duncan Bonfield, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the International Federation of Sovereign Wealth Funds in London.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Hubert.
Hello.
Thanks. And we have Israel Marufu from Zimbabwe Pension Fund.
It's bigger than initially listed.
Okay. We have colleagues from Ithmar Capital, the Moroccan Sovereign Wealth Fund on the line. I don't know who from the fund is present, but hope you're all welcome. We have Noha Khalil, who is the CRO from the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund. We have Angela Miller-May from the Chicago Pension Fund, Teachers Pension Fund in the United States.
How do we record this?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good. And John, I'm not sure if we introduced you, but we also have John Denton, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. That might be a double roll call, but
Is Maggie here?
okay. We also have Richard Mwinga, who's the former director from the Zambian Public Service Pension Fund.
How are you?
Okay, very good, thank you.
How do we record this?
Hi, Demba just joined.
Okay, excellent. We also have Demba Diallo, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Senegalese Sovereign Wealth Fund, Strategic Investment Fund, FONSIS, on the line.
Hi.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much. We also have Nicholas Fursley, who is the Director General of the World Pensions Council on the line. Welcome, Nicholas.
Okay.
Fantastic. So I think with that brief call, hopefully we can commence our dialogue. And thank you everybody for your participation and making the time. Start by on behalf of Africa Investors saying it's a great to welcome you to the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum COVID-19 virtual roundtable. You know, our focus today is really going to be on roll call again. If I can just ask everyone to please, at this stage, mute their microphones. And then as we ask you to speak as a panel speaker or a discussion, we will call on you. Fantastic. So coming straight into the subject, as we know, the COVID-19 epidemic is having a great impact on the continent economically, which has been compounded by the oil shock, which has precipitated quite a tragic set of circumstances for the private sector, in particular the small and medium-sized enterprises. We know from research that the estimates indicate that African economies' GDP is potentially going to decline from 3 to 8% in 2020 as a consequence of COVID-19, resulting in a consequent suffering of paralysis for the economies of between 90 to $200 billion, according to the estimates in the market. So the shock will naturally squeeze the fiscal space quite dramatically in the continent, as deficits are estimated to widen from essentially 3.5 to 4.9 percentage points, increasing Africa's financing gap by an additional $110 to $154 billion this year. With that in mind, it indicates that Africa's total public debt could increase under the base case scenario from about 1.86 trillion by the end of 2019 to a situation now which could be over 2 trillion in 2020, which is compared to the 1.9 trillion projected in a no pandemic scenario. And if you look at the African Development Bank's report, these figures could actually reach 2.1 trillion in 2020 under a worst case scenario. So naturally, I'm glad to have all of your fine minds and resources and commitment to helping us think through as an industry some of the bold actions that we will need to consider and put forward as solutions and implement where appropriate. The impact of the global pandemic on African economies includes the disruption of global supply chains, being exposed to inputs from Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, as well as lower demand in global markets for a wide range of African exports that are likely to be delayed or reduced as the foreign direct investment is redirected by international partners, redirecting capital locally. And as we know, on a practical level, returning businesses to operational health in the so-called new normal after a severe shutdown is an extremely challenging and complex exercise. But if any community has the ability to support our economies, governments, and policymakers plan for and anticipate long-term investment needs, priorities, and priorities, so our economies can essentially stabilize, grow, and thrive again. I believe that many of you on this call, many of you on this round table will have a significant role to play in helping us address and helping the continent and helping your institutions and the globe ultimately, recover from this situation. We have unparalleled experience in long-term and investing, and I think this is going to be invaluable as the policymakers call on the industry to get a better clarity about how they can engage with us as the asset owners and the long-term institutional investors that will be critical in terms of paving the way for the new normal. This will take collaboration, coordination, and an intimate focus on the correlation, something that we're hearing a great deal now. We've seen the world coordinate when it comes to reconstituting an economy that is a very complex makeup from the real economy, SMEs to large corporates to public and private markets. There are a lot of correlations that we all will need to be focused on and have a good handle on. But that being said, we are long-term asset owners and financial investors. So we naturally need to defend our ability to fight for our members and our future generations. There are a number of initiatives afoot at the moment calling for a deferment of loan principles in the market at the moment for key institutions during this year. But what we also know is that whatever financial arrangements we end up with, particularly for commercial debt, we will eventually need to contemplate a scenario of engaging with the Paris Club. And with that, there are natural implications which mean that there will be a dwindling number of banks that will be prepared to lend to countries in crisis. That being said, there are a number of domestic and international initiatives we can take inspiration from. For example, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority has just been approved to make a contribution, an allocation of $150 million for the stabilization fund for Nigeria to fight COVID-19. Yesterday, the African Union and a private sector group I'm part of has established a COVID-19 response fund, which is a 150 million initially, but it will grow to 400 million. We have seen a very significant leadership position taken by the African Development Bank, who have recently listed a COVID-19 social bond on the London Stock Exchange, and yesterday announced that they have established and been given board approval for a $10 billion COVID-19 response fund. We've also seen the African Export-Import Bank establish a $3 billion COVID-19 trade facility to help governments be able to continue to meet their trade responsibility during this testing time. And from the international funds and sovereign wealth funds, we've seen example pension fund side from Caisse de Dépôt of Quebec, CDPQ of Quebec, who have established a $4 billion facility for investments for locally affected businesses, which is running alongside a $300,000 community donation. We've also seen one of the Russian sovereign wealth funds, the Russian Direct Investment Fund, making direct investments to diagnostic systems for the detection of COVID-19 as an international effort. This roundtable today is essentially designed to provide a brief update on the global business responses and the priorities to fight COVID-19, and explore the practical steps and recommendations of current initiatives that are being taken on the continent, and of course to go into some detail on the role of African institutional investors and the role that African asset owners can play in responsibly fighting the COVID-19. Our focus will be on this roundtable will be to generate some recommendations, principally in two areas. The immediate priority responses, firstly, will be focused on, with a particular focus on actions to protect African capital markets, SMEs, supply chains, and the African continental free trade area. How to protect these aspects from the economic fallout of the crisis. And secondly, to look at partnerships with regulators. A lot of those initiatives that I've just outlined, and I know that there are many more. I'm sure we'll hear some other suggestions and initiatives from you on the call. But a number of the policymakers, the regulators, are really looking to hear the voice of the institutional investment community as an industry to help inform them as they think about fostering the industry shifts to the next normal regulatory environment that's going to be required to rebuild our economies so that they can stabilize, grow, and ultimately thrive. So to address these issues on today's roundtable, we'll be led by a number of discussion leaders who will share their perspectives and recommendations on these major areas and themes. Just by way of quick introduction of the actual discussion leaders, it will be Uche Orji, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. Are you there, Orji? Uche? We'll be calling back into you. Who we know is on the line, a good colleague, Mbui Wagacha, who is the former acting chair of the board of the Central Bank of Kenya and the former chair of the Kenyan Sovereign Wealth Fund. We have David Nyoma, who is the CEO and principal officer of the Government Institutions Pension Fund of Namibia. We have Eamon Solomon, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sovereign Fund of Egypt. And we have John Denton, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, the World Business Organization. And we have Nick Fursley, who is the Director General of the World Pensions Council out of Paris. And last but by no means least, we have Duncan Bonfield, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the International Federation of Sovereign Wealth Funds. But by way of housekeeping, I just want to again take this opportunity to ask you to please ensure that you activate mute on your computers. And if you wish to ask a question, if you just go to the chat box and direct your question to the host, ensure that the question is put to our panelists. I know that Uche may be a little bit delayed. Uche, are you on the... Have you connected as yet? No? Okay. So then I think we'll start with our good colleague, Mbui Wagacha. And Mbui, I've outlined the sort of two major focus areas that I'd like you to touch on. But I'm going to ask you to touch on those, but also give us your perspectives on the macro management and the risk management dimensions of COVID-19 that you see as highly relevant and challenging in Africa. That will be your start. Please, everybody, we will go through each of the roundtable discussants, and then we will be looking to the relevant questions that you have and have a discussion. Over to you, Mbui.
Thank you very much, and I would like to welcome my colleagues, some of whom we've met in New York and Johannesburg, and I'm very, very glad to rejoin you at this critical time in our economic history. And I would like to follow through with what Hubert has just described. Basically focusing on the two main issues: what is happening under COVID-19, our stock exchanges and supply chains. We are facing a huge sharp fall in our stock exchange capital flight. Kenya, for example, Nairobi Stock Exchange lost 458 billion shillings. Historic, has never happened before to this extent. Africa, as the World Bank just reported, is facing a recession for the first in 25 years. And the output costs to the continent are estimated at 37 to 79 billion. For 2020 alone, growth rates cut down to negatives, 2.1 to about negative 5% in GDP growth. So we are in for a very, very sharp correction in our path to growth. Now, on the impacts and what sovereign wealth funds and pension funds are capable of doing, we've already seen, as Hubert just pointed out, about the case of Nigeria, which has put in $150 million. In many senses, whatever sovereign wealth funds and pension funds do towards COVID is a bit of a correction for the capital flight that is taking place. And this correction, for example, in the case of Nigeria, is being directed to the three-tier levels of the economy. And we are not alone. You know, Norway dipped into its sovereign wealth fund, Iran did, China did. And to the extent that sovereign wealth funds, our sovereign wealth funds, especially African sovereign wealth funds, invest normally in international markets, any withdrawals under the stabilization fund are corrections of that capital flight. And perhaps withdrawals for COVID then can be described as reverse flows that are counter the capital flight. And perhaps to whatever extent we do not know, we'll begin to the journey for corrections. And I think there's a lesson to be learned here, that our capital market, our sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, which normally put their portfolios in international markets, should begin to find a way through opportunities through COVID to return home to domestic investment. And here, I think one of the sterling performances that is taking place is the work of the African Development Fund. Two conspicuous activities: the $3 billion bond, already oversubscribed to about 4.6 billion, to fight COVID. And it goes in the same direction because this is a drawing from global markets to the continent to attempt to help with the corrections for COVID impacts. And then the facility that has just been announced for 10 billion, a facility which African Development Bank is going to operate towards mitigating COVID effects. Now, there's an element which also works in the same direction of correcting capital flows, which is that some governments have taken measures to ensure that shareholder outflows are taxed. Kenya just raised the withholding tax for shareholder dividends, etc., raised it up by about 50% to 15% from 10%. And we are not alone. I think we should begin taking lessons from other countries, even developed economies, because here we can see the case of Germany, which has attached to its stimulus package attached to corporate assistance, attached a requirement that we should try, that companies should delay dividend payments. So in a sense, those are two important elements, dynamics that are going on in the capital markets, and lessons are that we should try in every possible way when we use our economic stabilization windows, try to help that correction and learn lessons from that. Now, the second main topic is that of partnerships with policymakers. This, in my view, is critical. Governments, however difficult it has been, African governments have tried to create bailout funds and stimulus packages. And some of these packages have directly assisted the corporate sector of the economy. And it is very clear in my mind that we should try and begin to convert some of the assistance to corporates, use this to build bridges between government and regulatory bodies, and also with corporate enterprises. And that collaboration should begin to see some element of conversion, of equity, of the assistance portfolio, or some of the stabilization assistance to equity stakes. In other words, there is no way, I think, going forward, we can strictly separate government assistance to corporates from corporate operations. In a sense, I think we will need a collaboration to be built, bridges to be built between government and government assistance to corporates, to be built to corporate running of enterprises. So we will need to see some conversion of some of the stimulus package to corporates into equity stakes. Here is the opportunity for sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. The opportunity is that the rollback of portfolio holdings, government portfolio holdings from the stimulus packages, the portfolio holdings can be rolled back to sovereign wealth funds. And why is this so critical going forward? It is important that the collaboration produces some core investing with emphasis on methods to fight back events like COVID-19, events such as governance issues that might disrupt the operations of corporates, events such as private sector decisions that might be negative to nature, might be negative to the environment, might be negative to governance. And it's an opportunity to basically put in Santiago principles, which most of you are familiar with, put them right in the heart of government-private sector collaboration in industry. So I would like to add one element, one or two elements, which I think are also important in going forward. And this is what Hubert called the macroeconomic policy expectations going forward. The main event here is that COVID-19 has compromised markets, compromised the market system very significantly. In other words, the expected traditional policy of, for example, monetary and fiscal policy mix to drive economic recovery won't work unless we also take account of the kind of impacts that COVID has brought about on the supply side of the economy. In this case, in the current instance, supply side impacts of COVID are already reducing the power of monetary policy and fiscal policy. In other words, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at business, if you have stay-at-home rules and you have lockdowns and you have social distancing and you have paid leave to workers without producing goods and services, then the market cannot work. You know, the credit that you expect from central banks to be absorbed into rebuilding the economy cannot take place on its own. Neither can, and on the other hand, many governments do not only not have the fiscal space to support the stimulus packages, but the fiscal spending seems to be very, very strongly compromised towards supporting livelihoods, supporting small and micro enterprises, supporting households, rather than big industry. So in a sense, we have to have a meeting point between monetary policy, fiscal policy, and a recovery of households from below.
Get that, you're free to.
Right. You now, have you made your key recommendations? Because I'd like, I understand Uche has just come on the line and was going to compliment, I'm sure, some of the points that you were making as good recommendations.
One of the key recommendations is that we should find ways to find a method to convert stimulus packages, some kind of government equity, which can be rolled back to sovereign wealth funds. In other words, sovereign wealth funds should be sort of in unwinding some of the stimulus package support. We should enhance the role of sovereign wealth funds that operate domestically rather than placing their portfolios abroad.
Okay.
And then let me make this final point, 2 points, and I'll be done for now, Hubert.
Okay.
One is that in this kind of scenario, where markets are compromised, and you need a third element of stabilization, other than monetary policy, fiscal policy, you need this element where you have government on the table. You will need some kind of private sector representation in setting expenditure priorities, in setting fiscal expenditure priorities. Now, all this boils down to a proposal that I would like to suggest to the team, that Africa investors should maybe find a way of issuing a path-breaking and historic study to create a path going forward, a new path for sovereign wealth funds in the post-COVID era. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mbui, and I really appreciate your perspective and your comment. And your recommendation is certainly noted, something that we'd be happy to explore. But as I mentioned in my opening, one of the examples is of the role of a sovereign wealth fund and the intervention of the sovereign wealth fund was the $150 million allocation made by the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. So I'm glad now to call on the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority and our co-chair today, Audrey, to make some remarks. Over to you, Chair.
thank you very much, Hubert, and thank you, colleagues, for taking the time to join this webcast. Unfortunately, I'm only able to join you by audio. The video quality is not so good. And I think that throws up something important. Maybe we all should spend some time and invest in technology in our various home states so that we can continue to interact, because I think the use of web interactions and video will probably be the new normal, where we travel less and do more via video conferencing. May I also please suggest anybody else who's not speaking to mute their lines, because there's still some feedback on the line. I will say the following 3 or 4 things. The first is sovereign wealth funds were set up for a time like this. Okay, we're set up for a time when there's going to be economic stress. Unfortunately, many of us in Africa were only very recent creations, so we have not built the depth of capital necessary to support the countries that to support our various home governments. But having said that, the fact that these institutions are available even provides, no matter how limited, some level of support, I think is appreciated. If anything, I believe that once we come out of this session, many of our countries' governments will appreciate the role that we play and provide significantly more support in the future. And that calls for, number 2, being creative, being bold, and to some extent actually putting yourself out there to support and help. And here's what I mean by that. At the NSIA, and I personally believe that this pandemic is as sad as it is and lives are being lost. From an investment perspective, it is time to be contrarian. It is time to be contrarian. It is time to put money to work, and it is time to put money to support and help our various home governments overcome this situation. At the NSIA, we've always had healthcare and agriculture as our 2 top areas of investment out of 5, 2 of our top 5 areas of investment, and we're going to re-emphasize that more now. One thing is clear. Today, the most important things today are food and healthcare. And the reality is that this is an area where we must strike the balance between social impact and commercial investment. There's an opportunity here. It's a young continent, it's a growing continent, and many of us will look for ways to ensure that we are invested here. On healthcare, as well as pharmaceuticals in particular, it's also a strategic area of importance that I think many of us will need to be looking and paying attention to supporting. Because one of the things that really troubles me today is the fact that pharmaceuticals is now being seen as a tool of national security. And so with India limiting exports, China limiting exports of active pharmaceutical ingredients, it becomes a matter of urgency that we all look to these areas as areas of investment. As consequently, we are looking to put money to work here. The same thing for the markets, and for those who have allocation to invest internationally, I would look internationally as well to invest. And I say that only because if you look back at history, every one of these situations, and quite frankly, the only thing that is closest to what we have seen now is the 1918 influenza pandemic. But one will argue that that does not even come close, because at that time, the world was not as integrated as it is today. Even the more recent example of SARS doesn't quite seem to come close, because I remember SARS very well, and I had a first-hand experience with SARS. During the time of SARS, China accounted for roughly 7% of global production. Today, China is 28% of global production, and significantly almost maybe something closer to 25% of global trade. So it is important, it's integrated, the whole world is integrated. So these things tend to have an outsized impact. But also as asset managers, this is a contrarian opportunity. And so for us, we're looking for the time when we think it's right to put money in the market. And quite frankly, that time, is now. It's now. Now, I will also say the following thing. We must look for ways to intellectually, my third point, intellectually support a creative approach to investments. And many of us will need to know that the impact of this COVID, and I was just reading a report about an hour ago, which said that, and it's an economic report, that said over the next 2 years, the impact of COVID will be the equivalent of a loss of production of $5 trillion. $5 trillion is the entire GDP of Japan. which is the third largest economy in the world. So it's a significant number that will be at risk. Consequently, cash will be tight and be tight for some time. So people need to think a little bit more creatively. And my sense is that for many of us, one of the things that will make sense is to be a little bit more, adopt more the asset management model. One of the biggest challenges I have seen in my home country, and I believe many of you will probably say the same, is the challenge of dead capital. Capital that is tied down in areas that could be made more productive. Capital that is tied down in uncompleted projects. Capital that is tied down in inefficiently managed projects. Taking on some of those projects on behalf of the country, turning them around, bringing in partners to help get those capital and make them more commercially viable could be a way to grow not only the asset under management, but also to grow the fund. My number 4 point is regional cooperation. One thing that is clear today, this impact of this could lead to more nationalistic instincts in developed markets, but perhaps also lead to more regional integration in developed markets. Within Africa, my sense is that no country in its own can grow without trade. So there's been many things done in trying to bring African countries together. But I think in more ways than none, in cooperation within countries, especially neighboring countries or regional blocs, is very, very important. And the final point I will make is this. This is also a time, as much as it's time to put money to work, it's also a time to operationally be a little bit more conservative in terms of, what we do with how we run our various businesses. So we're being very careful and trying to ensure that we are right-sized for the environment. But I'll end my comments by saying this too shall pass. These experiences come and they go. And I think, and I'm hoping that, once the vaccine is found and then there's rapid testing, then we might be able to start to recover. But I see it as an investor, I see more opportunities, and I'm hoping that we take advantage of the crisis to reform the way we do businesses, help our home government, and then look forward to making meaningful contributions. So with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uche. Spot on, and you're clearly, just like us all, at the coalface of these issues. And it takes me to a conversation that I was having with some other sovereign fund colleagues internationally, and we were looking at some of these different scenarios and ideas, and their views are that we may be really seeing a bit of a pivot now towards not just the sovereign wealth fund, but more the sovereign development fund concept. A bit more like the Mubadalas of this world, who can act a bit more nimbly. And the suggestion is that a number of our funds on the continent are well placed to do that, and the co-investment approach, particularly co-investments around critical infrastructure and trade-related infrastructure, industrial infrastructure that are ESG compliant, could position us quite well in anticipation of what is this ongoing and parallel crisis called climate change. If we don't sort of prioritize some of these approaches to investing, as we've seen from this crisis, we are unable to protect our portfolios from such a crisis. And with that said, you touched very neatly on the international market, and I know in the interest of time and other engagements, I'd now like to call on John, our good friend John Denton, who is a great supporter of our work on the continent and a good advocate for Africa in the international market and the African private sector. But so, John, if I can call on you now just to let us understand some of the actions that you're taking and some of your views on the issues that we're discussing today.
Oh, look, Hubert, thank you very much. Actually, it's a great honor to be participating in this discussion. One of the challenges we find at the moment is that at a peak level, there is still an absence of real-time knowledge, of real-time situations in real countries with real businesses, with real people. As much as you all are engaged in the African battle against COVID, so the extraordinarily important battle to save lives, and at a peak level, there's still a lot of distraction about this. And one of the roles I see of the International Chamber of Commerce. And just to be clear, we're 100 years old. We are the institutional voice of 45 million businesses globally. What I'm finding more and more is that we're being asked, particularly in this crisis, to bring the views of the real economy into these policy discussions at a global level, which is really, on one level, pleasing for us as an institution, but disappointing that what we're still seeing is a lot of the playbook from the global financial crisis being deployed in response to fundamentally major disruption, not just from a health and societal point of view, but to the real economy. And the consequence of that is that if you want to preserve and stop the carnage in the real economy, you really have to focus as well on how you keep SMEs, micro SMEs, independent entrepreneurs, and frankly, the formal economy functioning, and not enough attention is being paid to that. So in that context, we have launched a global campaign which is Save Our SMEs. A particular focus is on a series of principles that attach that, but of course the principles are global. The reality is regional and country by country, so we are very particular. You should be aware that there are, and you are aware, I'm sure, that there are particular short-term critical policy decisions that will need to be made and opportunity. And the one in particular we're focused on the moment, which I think has got relevance, particularly when I heard the first speaker speak, and some of Hubert's introductory comments, is on the spring meeting of the IMF World Bank and the gathering that will occur alongside that of finance ministers. We think that's particularly important because we are very concerned, as a number of you would be, and I think as Hubert has also acknowledged along the way, that in order to stimulate and provide opportunity for fiscal stimulus, particularly in emerging economies, there are inhibitions in the way of international financial institutions and others, and actually talking about the Paris Club along the way. But the idea somehow, in this point of view, appointed to this time, that sovereign governments should be asked to choose between paying nurses and paying their debt interest is just ridiculous. So we will be calling, and we're mobilising in a spring meeting, a significant call to action to suspend debt payments to enable the IFIs and others to actually focus on doing what they should be doing, which is finding the headroom for you and support your economies. That's the first step. The second step we're focusing on at the spring meeting is the reality that unless we focus on the speed that is required, been touched on a little bit in the discussion, the reality money into the SMEs and the micro SME sector, then we'll be talking about this for a long time. And I think we all know that even on the most recent numbers coming out of a crisis like Hurricane Katrina, 10% of SMEs never reopened. And when you look at the scale of the disruption and the tragedy of COVID-19, that number will fail unless we keep those elements open. And so additional methods being used in which the number of the major institutions are still how they intervene in local markets and support sovereign states, particularly those who don't have headroom to actually bring out their own stimulus packages, is quite disturbing. The idea that this can all be intermediated through banks is also not going to play. The reality, we're already seeing this in developed markets, that banks are not speedily intermediating. They're actually using a lot of the funds to buttress their own balance sheets. They're also actually requiring similar covenants, etc. So we are suggesting alternate mechanisms, particularly a region like Africa, and I can be more particular, that you could be even more vague. There are alternate mechanisms to actually provide speedy access to funds to SMEs and micro SMEs, and we'll be arguing for that with particular examples, using mobile money, digital wallets, telcos using credit card facilities, etc. And so we will be particular that from each jurisdiction. But we do think that's an important call that needs to be made, and it may not be your observation at this point in time, but it's certainly the observation that's emerging. I'm going straight from this call into a discussion with our Latin American group of national committees and chambers, and this is a particular issue in Latin America, by the way, about the lack of speed and lack of accessibility. And I was told this morning by our developed country participants that this is not reserved for emerging markets. This is what's happening in the UK. Less than 1% of of applicants for access to this purportedly speedy stimulus package for SMEs have actually already been approved. And most of us know there's only about a 27-day window for SMEs and micro SMEs. So they're quite practical issues that we're focusing on at the moment. And I do draw your attention to that. We also do want to engage much more in discussions with the African Development Bank and others. So, in fact, I've been able to participate in this discussion at this point in time. I think from our perspective, very valuable, and we're very respectful to engage with you. We are support advocacy, and we are particularly what you need. And on the ground, we are developing tools now to actually support SMEs and micro SMEs in country, be it putting together a business continuity plan, which, as you know, most SMEs and micro SMEs don't have. We've actually developed one, deployed one, and made that available to the chambers of commerce in your country and the national committees as well for them to use. We've actually upgraded our position on force majeure to actually enable that to happen. We've also flexed our access to trade finance, all these sorts of issues. And we are using this as a huge push to move the world from analog in trading and financing to digital. So all these things are designed to actually facilitate speedy interventions and support for the real economy. And I was asked to meet with the new manager of IMF on Monday. First, all these points, they're very eager for our engagement next week because they know they need support. Also with the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, similarly, and with the World Bank. So that's what we're trying to do. Simultaneously, we've been convening, we were the first group to call for a virtual meeting of the G20. We've actually gave direction as to what should happen in terms of what sort of global cooperation should be found. What we came out with was good, but not great, to be frank. We actually turned our attention and we worked with trade ministers, going back to your the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. You know, more work needs to be done on that, even just enabling supply chains to operate for medical goods and services. We actually provided a 10-point plan for the trade ministers, which has been adopted. I'm invited to participate in the next G20 trade minister meeting, and I'll be saying points about opening supply chains, about doubling down on support for SMEs trading opportunities. So I might just leave it at that there. I just want, I suppose, a bit of a pen picture of what we see as key priorities at the moment in terms of advocacy around debt and around speed of access to funds and actually thinking differently. Part of what I think Nigeria was saying is a paradigm shift needs to occur in the way these issues are. And secondly, the issues. And if you have a chance, I do invite you to look at our SME camp. It's actually being deployed on a global basis. We have a lot of support from African chambers of commerce and from national committees as well. And there's obviously an opportunity for sovereign wealth funds and others to be supportive of the principles contained therein. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. You've touched on a number of issues that are very close to our hearts. Obviously, a large proportion of the African private sector is made up of small and medium-sized enterprises, and they are a complete priority for a number of us in our everyday lives. If the SMEs are not functioning, then our economies don't function. Also, the issue around digital, we see those two issues as one issue effectively. What level of assistance can we bring to help digitize SMEs in addition to the other levels and different interventions so that they can reconstitute their businesses so to be able to compete in the new economy. So your advocacy with the IMFs, the G20s, to double down on that point is appreciated. And of course, as I mentioned, infrastructure. You sit on the board of probably the largest Australian infrastructure platform with over nearly $200 billion that you're investing into infrastructure. We also encourage you to take a message back to that board to potentially look at infrastructure co-investments that have an ESG dimension. I think that would be very valuable. And also, as Uche mentioned, many of our funds deploy capital internationally. So this could be an opportunity to look at co-investments around some of these infrastructure projects, and the likes of the platform that you represent on the board we could also begin to look at how we can work globally to share knowledge, expertise, and co-investment opportunities. And with that said, and in the interest of time, I just want to recognize our good colleague who will also be saying some words a bit later on, Demba Diallo, the CEO of the Sovereign Fund from Senegal. You're welcome. But in the order of the roundtable discussions, I'm now going to move to David Roma, who is the CEO and Principal Officer of the Government Institutions Pension Fund of Namibia, one of the continent's largest pension funds invested across Africa. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Hubert, and hello to all the colleagues. The topic that we are discussing today is so instructive, and it's indeed timely, and I would like to thank Hubert for organizing this. First of all, nobody has ever been prepared for the magnitude of the crisis in which the world finds itself. I'll be very brief. With regard to the pension funds, it's a different ballgame. Unlike sovereign wealth funds, which have a different purpose, our purpose as pension funds, and I speak in particular for the GIPF, Government Institution Pension Fund of Namibia, we have a liability to cover, and that is to provide support to our members in the long term once they retire. However, under the current circumstances, it calls into question, what is it that we can do with the wealth and the savings that we have accumulated over time? We have been looking at it in three components. One, it is with regard to within the framework of our strategic asset allocation. What is it that we can do when it comes to government support in respect of the borrowing programs? That is not restricted to government only, but also private issuance of debt locally. And that is an area that we are going to be actively participating, and luckily, we still have room in our strategic asset allocation in that regard. But what is also very important is the level of prudence that has to be exercised at all times, so that in event times like this come, there is a buffer, an element of reserve that one can be able to exercise. And the second area that I would like to mention is in respect of strategic business support. Through our unlisted investment programs and alternative investment programs, we have allocated significant amounts of money within the country and also on the continent in infrastructure support. And I think this is the time when these funds and these mandates can play a crucial role. And the other area is in the areas of investment, obviously with a view to get a return, but in those sectors that have got significant impact. Here, I'm really happy to say that we have invested in the pharmaceutical industry and food production. And these have become really an area of need at this point in time. And I assume in all countries, not only in Africa, but in all countries, these areas of supply have become critical and essential. And it is an area that we as a continent need to look at. We have seen how insular the world has become. Borders have been closed, and countries are looking at internal satisfaction first before they look beyond. In fact, there is no talking of looking beyond. The only country I've seen talking about looking beyond is China at this point in time. Everyone else is shutting borders and looking inward as to what to do. And I'm also happy to see that yesterday the Southern African Development Community, when it comes to free trade area, issued a statement, a communique, coordinating the issue of the flow of essential commodities and essential supplies within the region. And that is crucial because at the beginning there was an element of panic, which led to the shutdown of borders, and trucks and trains stranded across borders that they could not pass through, providing essential commodities. But now with the support, with the coordination that is taking place at the regional body level, I think that is really good. And one recommendation I would like to make is for the other regions in Africa to also perhaps emulate what has just taken place in Southern Africa. Of course, the implementation is another issue, whether the customs and immigration officials are also going to play along with that policy high-level decision that has been taken place. The issue of partnership. In Namibia, at the very beginning when this crisis unfolded, the Namibia Association of Savings and Investment came together and actively made a proposal to government on stimulus package that can be coordinated, and that stimulus package has since been adopted as policy, of course, with the necessary amendments by the Ministry of Finance and government in general. And it is showing a unity of purpose that needs to be perhaps emulated elsewhere. But what I can only underline here is that this is a crisis that is unprecedented. It is still unfolding. What measures we are talking about here, there are still measures that we may have to adjust along with the unfolding situation. For now, I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Very, very critical points, very practical takeaways for us. And again, I like your emphasis on how can we responsibly invest. And one of the key themes that we as a forum are always looking to do is create those linkages between the African institutional investors, particularly in the areas of sharing more information, exploring more co-investment opportunities. And I think this crisis hopefully is going to bind us together, and we'll be able to look at more concrete opportunities and act with a shared voice, a unified voice when we work with our policymakers, both the central bank governors, the ministries of finance, and the other appropriate public sector counterparts. I'm going to move now to Richard Wingo, who used to head the Public Service Pension Fund, because it's important the way that you drew the distinction between the responsibilities and of a pension fund versus that of a sovereign fund. And Richard, it'd be great if you could just give us your perspective from the pension fund communities side in Zambia, and also how you are addressing some of these fiscal issues with the likes of the challenges that the government may have in terms of being close to a potential, or managing a default scenario. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I just want to say that it's very important that we are discussing these very important issues that are pertaining to this crisis. And it's a pandemic that is very serious. It's a threat to our economies. It's a threat to our investments. And as long-term investors, institutional investors, especially pension funds, there is need for pension funds to act as soon as possible. And what I have to say is that in regard to Zambia, I think pension funds, pension schemes, like these large pension schemes, like our NAPSA, Public Service Pension Fund, these public schemes, they have tried as much as possible to see how they can help government in terms of funding or putting some resources to help in the fight against the virus itself. And I think it's going a long way, and there's still quite a number of measures that have been put in place by quite a number of these pension funds. It's very, very important that even as we know that Zambia is essentially a mining country, and there are quite a lot of developments that are happening even in our mining sector. We find that the country has found itself in quite difficult stress, and there is need to find ways and means of leading our people in regard to this fiscal stress that we have in this country. But as long-term investors, what we would want to see is that we ensure that responsible environment, social and governance still remains a front-line approach in our investments, because this is very important, that there is a linkage between the environment and social issues, even as we also diverge on thematic issues in terms of our investments, things like COVID-19. We need to specifically see how actually we come in as helping in terms of like health and the other types of funds that actually the pension fund should be in. The greatest interest is, of course, with citizens, and in that regard, we as pension funds have to see how we help government. We are doing our investments, and also in terms of the same area, mitigating the socio-economic impact. You know, as pension funds, we have two main objectives: one of economic objective and also the social objective. And we do know that as the COVID-19 effect will be effect on our people, and so very, very important that we found we safeguard our people in terms of how we sustain them over a long period of time, because this COVID-19 is going to have long-term effects. It's already having quite a number of effects on the economy and on our people, and it will have quite a long-term effects over a longer period of time. So we need to see how we support the business, the SMEs, and also ensure that the markets in which we are investing are also protected to manage the risk, because COVID itself is a risk and it must be taken into consideration even as we are investing in our communities. So those are some of the... Yes.
You were finishing, sorry.
Yes. Those are some of the thoughts that I think I should share with this forum. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And it's good to have that additional pension fund perspective. And of course, we're looking to bring some of these recommendations together and again, see how we can foster some of the cooperation amongst like-minded funds for your markets. I'm going to move now again, just so that we can keep the momentum and have our final pension fund perspective, but from an international speaker, and this is going to be Nick Bursley, who is the Director General of the World Pensions Council. So Nick, grateful to have your views. You know, what's really happening out there internationally? What are you seeing in the continent? Over to you.
Hubert, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm aware of time, so I just want to throw in a few ideas for the sake of argument. And the first one would be the following. And maybe it's a bit provocative, but I think pension funds already are making a huge sacrifice. And it's something that goes unnoticed or undernoticed, and I think it's important to stress. Why did pension funds the world over, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, already made a huge sacrifice for a very simple reason? Governments, you know, policymakers, ministers, lawmakers, supranational institutions such as, you know, the IMF or the World Bank, and the development banks. So everyone and their sister in the past 5, 6, 7 weeks have said, okay, look, because of the immensity of the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis, we're going to ask companies, corporates, to make a sacrifice, and we're going to ask, bankers, insurance companies, lenders, to cut down drastically on the dividends they serve to their shareholders. So we've seen many companies in New York, London, Paris, and even in Africa in the past 2 or 3 weeks. The CEO said, fine, for the next quarter, the next semester, or even the next year, we're going to curtail our dividends or cut down our dividends by 60, 70% or completely in the case of many banks and insurance companies, including in emerging markets, including in Africa, saying, okay, we're going to have zero dividend for the next 12 months. Now, who's paying most of the price? It's not the CEO or the CIO of the bank, it's the shareholders. And who are the main shareholders of these large listed African and European and US companies? They are essentially pension investors. So already, without asking their opinion in a way, we have already taken money out of the purse of the old retirees and pensioners. So what I want to say is that they have already made a sacrifice. Something else I want to say quickly is that it's tempting for a government, especially if you are, with all due respect, if you are an emerging market government from Latin America, Africa, Asia, but even here in Europe or in the US, it's very tempting in times of crisis to say, okay, my God, there's no money. There's no money, and you put yourself in the shoes of the finance minister or the prime minister or the president or whatever. There's no money. Where is the money? Okay, there's money in the pension pot. It's like a piggy bank. Let me break the piggy bank and get the money. That's an instinctive reaction. It's not only in emerging markets, even in so-called developed, northern hemisphere countries, they have that reflex, and it's a very dangerous reflex. So now I'm going to stop playing the devil's advocate, and I'm going to say something more optimistic. Is like bearing in mind that the pension funds are not piggy banks, bearing in mind that when they invest, it's a very long-term process and it's not a short-term fix. So what I mean by that, their assets, their monies shouldn't be used to fix things in the short term. And so there are many problems coming from COVID-19 and the corona crisis. And my opinion, my personal opinion, is that pension funds, they can contribute very positively, like Hubert alluded, and I think John also alluded this, and I think Uchi also said this. They can certainly contribute by freeing up resources for SMEs. I think it's very important, mid-sized enterprises, small caps, mid caps in Africa and elsewhere. They are really the backbone of the national economic rebirth. If there is a national survival of our economies in the West and Africa, I think it will come to a large extent from these small caps, mid caps, SMEs. And I think everyone, including the pension funds, should free up financial resources for them. And as Hubert and John said earlier, for infrastructure investment, yes, but it should be considered as medium or long-term assets. If there's a short-term fix for the African economies in the very short term, I think honestly most of the money cannot come from the pension funds. It will have to come from governments and from supranational organizations. And I want to finish my little, provocative utterance by saying that my fear, I'm based here in Paris, as you guys know, but I try to have, a global perspective. And our fear at the World Pensions Council, we're seeing now a myriad, and to use a Greek and a French word, we're seeing a myriad of disparate diverging initiatives coming from Washington, D.C., from London, from Brussels, and from Africa, and from China. And I think it won't be enough. I think we badly need a united global reply to the crisis. And I think Hubert and John alluded to it earlier. it needs to be coordinated and united. And I think, 6 weeks from now to the day, there is the meeting of the G7. We don't know yet if it's using WebEx or physically in Maryland, but let's say it's WebEx or whatever. But in 6 weeks of the day, there is the G7. If there isn't really, by then, at the very latest, on June 12, a truly global reply, and I think this is the elephant in the room, if Washington and Beijing can't put their rivalry in parenthesis for a few weeks or a few months, and if they can't learn, at least now, to resolve the crisis in the very short term, if Washington, D.C. and Beijing can't learn to work together constructively, I think it's going to be very difficult to resolve the crisis, especially for emerging markets. So I think emerging markets, their interest is basically to knock on the door of China and America and tell them, please guys, cooperate at least in the short, medium term for the sake of saving the world economy. I think this is really key in my opinion.
Thank you, Nick. Very, very passionate and appropriate points. I would also like to add to that. I would hope that Saudi Arabia and Russia can also learn to cooperate as well, because we're feeling the pain here, as is the rest of the world. I'm going to now, in that vein, turn to our sovereign wealth fund community to close out the panel perspectives, with Duncan to give us the global view. Then we go to Eamon, and then we're going to end up with Dimba Yalo. And Duncan, it'd be great to hear some of the issues that your sovereign wealth fund, you have every single sovereign wealth fund on the planet as part of your constituency. So I'll be really interested to see what's happening on the one hand. Secondly, as Nick has pointed out, as John's pointed out, as Uche has highlighted, we are financial investors. There's only, we cannot solve every single issue as asset owners. But I do think we have a particular expertise in long-term investing, and reshaping and modeling the new economy is some intellectual capital that I think we can put on the table and help our policymakers and governments understand the value of that as they need to reconstitute and regulate and drive this new normal economy from a base of stabilization ultimately to a thriving new normal economy. So over to you, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Hubert. Right, I'll pick up on your point about the leadership shortly. What I want to do is just start giving a very brief overview over what's been happening with sovereign wealth funds around the world. We had a conference call this morning where we heard from Australia, among others, that they've had the same issues as everybody, keeping their staff safe, making a transition to digital working, making sure that they have the right governance approaches. So I think everyone is going through that. From an investment perspective, we've got access to some data from one of the major custodians. It's about 15% of the world's tradable assets. And what that has said really over the last 6 weeks since the start of the real impact of the pandemic is surprising. We've seen, and this is for long-term investors, so pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. We've seen outflows from commodity-sensitive currencies and commodity-sensitive equities. We've seen the selling of emerging market foreign exchange versus the US dollar. Unsurprisingly, we've seen the highest levels of cash since 2009. And we've seen less to equity. In fixed income, there has been some inflows, there has been some risk appetite in things like high yield in corporate bonds. So it's not all negative. And in the equities, the defensive stocks such as utilities and healthcare have both done well. The outflows have been from the likes of energy and transportation. So that's very quickly the sort of the global view on how long-term funds have responded. There is inevitably a decline in the risk appetite of those funds, really as you would expect. So as a subset of sovereign wealth funds, we see some have a stabilization role. We know about Nigeria, you mentioned, Hubert, and we had Uche on before, where they've had some an element of drawdown and withdrawal from that fund. We've seen that certainly in some of the older funds with greater pools of capital, where they're serving that stabilization purpose. We've also seen with those funds that are responsible for multiple state-owned assets, state-owned enterprises, how quickly they've been able to respond and redirect some of their manufacturing and the like into responding to the crisis. So that's been a very big positive as well. So, but let me just now then look to the future and a couple of points. Firstly, to take up something said and something in Mbui meant to a debt sovereign wealth funds. Their intention and the investment cycle. That is going to become increasingly stretched and under in weeks. Governments are looking around how to resolve that. And that's why, as Mbui said, the importance of the Santiago principles and those governance and good governance really come into effect. So perhaps the challenge, as you've laid out, Hubert, is to start to think of a longer term thinking and an intellectual approach, how we can try and navigate through those different and this how can a very hugely important pools of expertise who can bring that to, who can offer government of the market and the language of investors, and they can play therefore a more role in the future of how that longer term recovery may come about. And the way I central banks, which are a very strong reputation intellectually, but also independence and a strong reputation across the continent. There's almost a parallel or a model there for sovereign funds to start to think about establishing themselves in that as key participants shaping the debate of the long-term future and the recovery of the various economies across the continent. So let me leave it there with just a couple of thoughts that maybe spark a bit of discussion.
Thank you, Duncan. I mean, those are really good points and things that we can act on today. I mean, we're already seeing a number of markets now anticipating an imminent coming out of lockdown. They think that they've flattened the curve and they're looking to reopen. You know, now is an opportunity for us to really be able to engage governments in that thinking and organize ourselves to provide that sort of expertise. So yeah, that's a good and actionable suggestion. Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Eamon to just give us his remarks.
Thank you. I've taken some interesting notes of the sentiment. I think there's a collective sentiment around this roundtable about where the priorities are going to be going forward. Looking inwards at our economies is becoming a priority. Nationalism is going to rise across the border, be it developed economies or emerging or frontier economies. It is becoming more of a pressing need. where I read parallels in across all economies, Africa, and I agree with what Duncan was talking about in terms of capital flows and capital flights. We read capital flights going, and capital flights are going to now rethink fundamentals, and the fundamentals are the more attractive our economies are, the more ESG definitely our economies can offer ESG friendly products our economies can offer, but also the more diverse and fundamental basis of investment opportunities we create between diversity on sustainable resources, on investment opportunities that are going into healthcare. Africa is a very populous continent, and we are seeing the largest population growth on the planet. If this is the case, and we are also shaping good examples, and I'm trying to look at the positive side beyond the rift, beyond this downside that we're going to see. I see a very sharp V curve coming, and I think I've done my consensus around various investment professionals, and everyone seems to agree that the rebound out of this is going to be quick, and the recovery is going to be quick. However, we need to just start preparing ourselves for that downside. Where we can play a proactive role is definitely go back to our governments, respective governments, and tell them where the sentiment is and where the priorities are, and how they can better present and refocus their economies to be more attractive to capital to come back in. Some of the larger populous economies like Nigeria, like Egypt, these are economies that have a significant portion of remittances coming from expatriates out of those economies. This is a particular element of the economy, and you can reposition that as an opportunity to create your own stabilization fund out of your own population that are looking to create saving opportunities, create debt instruments that are more attractive to that particular class of citizens. There are more creative ideas around asset classes similar to investment in infrastructure or investment in healthcare and in food. Definitely regional clustering is becoming a reality, even for Chinese investors. China itself is trying to diversify its own supply chain. Realizing the deficiency of that concentration, that creates an opportunity. Africa is a solid market as far as industrial hubs can be created, as a solid market as far as food play or food industry can become attractive markets for those capital flows to come into those spaces. This is a mix of short-term and long-term solutions. From a sovereign wealth fund standpoint, I try to share a view on what pension funds can do, and I understand the risk-averse nature of their mandates. However, they can still be asset-focused on investing in asset classes, either through the stock market or through the capital market or through debt instruments, but consciously direct those. And it's in a buyer's market, you can actually land a very good yield opportunity, as it's a riskier opportunity, but the yield would be rewarding because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you make the consciously right decision to invest in the right sector, then you are saving your own economy and safeguarding your own future returns coming from the different sectors of the economy. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it is a solid zero-sum game. On the debt side, monitoring where sovereigns can also help. Sovereigns can also avail debt instruments to be able to finance their own conscious buy-side investments, and this is part of the looking inwards at your economy. If you have an international portfolio, you can actually bank on some of those portfolio elements and look inwards. We, as a sovereign fund of Egypt, we are the youngest sovereign fund in this forum, and we are the newest to the market. However, we are banking on a legacy of assets that we have as an economy that's being directed towards the sovereign fund to make a better use out of those assets. And we're doing what we're preaching by saying we're looking at those assets, reclassifying those priority assets in the healthcare sector, in the food sector, and seeing these are the attractive ones that we should be focusing on and presenting to the market, either to local investors and trying to create those momentums, and everyone sees that opportunity. With the right attention from the government towards directing part of its spending towards those companies or those initiatives, then you can help yourself by creating that snowball effect. To summarize my point, on the shorter term, conscious decisions around where to invest, where you direct your buying power, and you direct them towards the sectors that are most relevant to the crisis, but also most relevant to a quicker recovery out of the crisis. And on the longer run, educate and preach to your government on the more diverse economies, the more robust these economies will stand, the more these economies can sustain hits like this. If you're an oil economy, you need to diversify out of it. Diversifying comes on across different elements. It's not only government spending or the private sector community spending, but also governed by the sovereign funds and the pension funds to also nurture those sectors that you need to grow. And it becomes a profitable investment proposition on its own. And it's not going to be just developmental funding.
Thank you very much. And again, really practical and useful recommendations. And just like everyone, I certainly look forward to working with you and other colleagues on really taking the points and recommendations from this discussion. This whole issue of the co-investments and the different ways that we can add value as financial investors, I think is going to be very powerful if it's presented in the right way and we collectively share our views both continentally as well as internationally. Demba, it would be great to get your views on this particular subject now. I know that you're very active in Senegal, both personally as well as institutionally.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Good afternoon to all our colleagues from Pension Fund and Sovereign Fund on the continent and in Paris. For instance, earlier someone talked about being more a development fund. So we, for instance, as a strategic fund in Senegal, we act more as a development fund. And in the past 6 years, we gathered a lot of experience in terms of investment. And so we invested in different industries, and right now, in this time of crisis, what we are doing, we are very hands-on. As I said to Uber earlier, we are very hands-on as we have identified, working with the government of Senegal, and 3 types of companies that do exist and on which we may put capital or at least assist them to be able to run. The first group is the companies whose activities contribute to the fight against the COVID. Mainly, these are healthcare companies and pharmaceutical companies. And for those companies, what needs to be done is, if you are a sovereign wealth fund or you are any PE fund, is to see how you can put more funds and to help them grow their production. For example, in Senegal, we have invested in a plant making high-vis solution. So right now, what we are doing is providing more funds to be able to sustain the fact that the importation will be cut. Because of the crisis, everyone will keep their own production. So we are beefing up the production of these companies and we are putting in more money. And right now, we are also expediting the delivery of a hospital that we are building inland. So we can have a number of emergency beds with enough ventilators. So this is very hands-on. As we are invested, so we are putting more money into those companies, into those projects to have them be able to sustain the issue that we will have related to the breakout of the value chain, or to the fact that some product will no more be exported by the countries making them. The second type of companies is companies that are running low right now because of the crisis, but which can reorient their activities to the fight. Like we can name hotels. In Senegal, what we are doing is that we are using hotels to put people into quarantine. So instead of hotel have been hit. So the government said that okay, we are going to use the hotel to quarantine people so that they will have some sort of activities. Same thing for airlines. We are using our national airlines to go and take the product in China or in Ethiopia. So what we are doing, this is two example, and we have a third group of companies where they can do a little shift onto their activities to be able to continue running. If we take the tailoring business, can take a shift and start making masks. Right now, there is a shortage of masks coming from China, which is the main producer. So right now in Senegal, we are taking some small and medium companies from around 100 tailoring machine, and then they are shifting to making masks and making some outfits that are needed by the medical world. So in terms of immediate response, that's what can be done. And at the same time, also, we have to, as one of our colleagues says earlier, to ensure that the supply chain is part of the fight. And then we should enable the transportation industry to be going through the region and also through the different countries. Economic measures. The government of Senegal has put out a 2 billion USD plan to help the people, but also to help companies. And right now we are working with them to see how they can put cash in SMEs and companies who are in trouble. So as a sovereign wealth fund, we are putting into the table our intellectual capital, as someone said earlier, trying to advise the government on what is the best way, or which is the best way to go to be able to provide this cash to the companies, apart from the tax policy that they have in place right now to help the companies. Now, talking about the future, as we are really short in time, I think that after the crisis, we have to do what we call back to basis. And for me, back to basis is coming back to investing in some areas which are really the basis of any countries. The first one being investing into hospital and urban and rural health centers, and also digitalize all the health sector. This is really important, how to digitalize the health sector. Second thing is investing into pharmaceuticals. This is what we see. It will be really important in Africa to invest really in pharmaceutical, in agribusiness, and the third one being, and the last one, trying to learn from the energy sector and apply it to the water sector so that we'll have some sort of independent water producer. So, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, food, and food transformation, and then water. As we are talking about infra, these are the basics that, for me, as a sovereign wealth fund, if we get out of the crisis, this is what that will be one of our focus. The energy part will be still an area where we will be investing very heavily, but we'll have as a priority this sector that I mentioned earlier.
Okay. Thank you very much, Demba. As ever, you've hit the nail right on the head. A number of very critical interventions at a very practical level that, if handled properly with that sort of medium to long-term view, can be good for business and great for the recovery and development. I'm going to do one of my usual things, and I'm sure the person I'm going to call on now is not surprised. I'm doing it for two reasons. First of all, because Demba has really touched on the importance of energy. And secondly, sorry, is because, we haven't been as gender sensitive and talked about women's issues as much as we should. So to add a bit of gender balance, Linda, if I may indulge you just to share some of your observations in a minute or two.
Hubert, I should have expected this. I think this has been a really good. Say again? Oh no, this is when my computer has decided to act up. But the views that have been shared here are really very constructive, and I think we should have a follow-up call very soon in the next week to kind of solidify some of the thinking. This is a situation that needs an urgent response and doesn't naturally align with our thinking as pension funds, because we tend to think for the very long term, for 10 years plus. And while we still have to do that, we also need to recognize the immediate needs that pertain at the moment. So I think, considering, for example, that our members of pension funds are not thinking about 20 years, they're just trying to survive this year. They're trying to retain an income, they're trying to stay employed, etc. So maybe it's a time for us to break out of our usual mold and start considering more pressing on the ground needs for now. But that's just my observation for now.
Fantastic, thank you, Linda. And Linda comes from she's the CEO of the Erskine Provident Pension Fund, currently one of the second largest pension fund in South Africa, and was the former investment director at the Government Employees Pension Fund, the largest pension fund on the continent. So I think we've got some really great views and perspectives here. Is there anyone with a burning urge to share their views? We can take just two interventions. I'm going to act on Linda's recommendation, the recommendation of a number of you, that we should follow up the excellent suggestions. You've been very generous and gracious by sharing with us and giving us your time. So we're going to be certainly looking to try to organize a follow-up call to take a number of these ideas and recommendations forward and ensure that we put them in a format that they can be appropriately communicated to the influential quarters that could hopefully find benefit in them. But is there anyone that would like to add their voice to this dialogue?
Hubert. Yes, Hubert, if it's possible.
Solomon?
Yes, it is.
Okay, over to you, Solomon.
Thank you. Just a couple of points. I also think it's been a very rich discussion. A lot of points have been raised, which I won't repeat. There's a couple that I just really want to emphasize. I really think it's important that we as long-term investors, sovereign wealth fund investors, pension funds, etc., avoid getting sucked into doing things, short-term fixes that will actually damage our financial sustainability ourselves in the long term. So it's very easy in an environment of panic and all hands on the deck that we do things that actually will damage ourselves. So I think it's very important. Of course, we have to play our short-term role through corporate social responsibilities and certain very carefully thought out interventions and investments that we can do, like some of those which were mentioned in Senegal, which I think are very good. And we're also doing similar things in Ghana in terms of encouraging our local businesses to get involved in the solutions, help making us more sustainable and more viable. And I think the flip side of nationalism, positive side of that, it could also lead to more self-reliance and self-sustainability. So I think it's very important. I think we have a very critical advocacy role, both with governments and with others, particularly in strengthening the medium and the long-term outlook.
a lot of people is all focused on the short term, which is understandable. But still, we need to be making our investments in our infrastructure, particularly in our technology and digitization. I think one of the problems that we have in Ghana, like many countries in Africa, is that we can't identify people. We can't get to help people. And it's very important in times like this that we should be able to identify and follow our citizens, even for tracing, for various things like that. So these investments in digitization technology is very important, and particularly trade platforms. The world is not going to go back to the way it was. There's going to be a shift, and the shift is going to be more technology, more platforms, less people interactions, and we should start investing in those areas as well. On the idea of the role of the multilateral development agencies and the donors, I think we have to put immense pressure on them to really look at debt relief, even if it's tied to specific things that the countries do, so we don't waste the opportunity of debt relief. But asking countries to pay and service debt in a time like this, I think is terrible. I also think for the first time, we have a lot of leverage. I expect more from China, particularly as in Africa, given how much China has been involved in Africa. And I think it's time for us to also expect them to help us more deeply with the solutions, whether it be their own debt forgiveness or investments or areas or subsidized trade activities, whatever. I think we have the right to expect and ask more from China. The final point that I would say, this comes on the back of the Africa Free Trade Association, is that we ourselves need to really focus more on trade barriers coming down between African countries. Inter-African trade and inter-African self-reliance, I think, is going to put us in a much stronger position post-Corona than we were before. But if there's one thing I want to emphasize to leave with you all, let's make sure that we don't make our own institutions financially unsustainable by not thinking through short-term interventions carefully for our own sustainability. Thank you, Hubert.
Thank you. Great points as always, Solomon. And I think almost combine your points about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a chance in a generation, a chance in a lifetime. Many of us grew up lamenting the fact that our markets are too small, they're too fragmented, and we now have this huge answer to a lot of the challenges that we've seen and we live with every day in front of us. So to organize ourselves better to take advantage of that has got to be a great priority. But that being said, one of the things that I was on a call just yesterday with the head of the UNDP, 44 offices across Africa. One of the programs that they've asked us to do is really say, can we put a digital platform together that can enfranchise industry in Africa and procurement in Africa that follows and unlocks the opportunities presented by the 3 trillion plus continental free trade area, digital trade finance, digital supply chains, digital matching of the key different suppliers and the buyers and the government procurers. And that's one thing that I think this group can also be instrumental. If you look at the Alibabas of this world, it was endowments and pension funds that were their first investors, interestingly. And I think we need to be, as you say, when we raise suggestions, we really need to be in a position to be able to evaluate the impact they can have in our own domestic markets, privately, across our own industries, as well as the extent to which they can contribute towards the development of our capital markets. So thank you for those comments. I see Gerald.
Hubert, quickly, just to let you know that what you just described about the platform, we want to be part of that. So I think if there's anybody else who likes the idea of the Free Continental Platform, technology platform, I think we're starting in that one.
Fantastic. Solomon, you've got a great advantage hosting the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. You're right at the nerve center, so your support is probably going to take this project leaps and bounds ahead. And of course, the Egypts of this world, the Nigerias of this trade, this pent up small and medium sized enterprise, real economy, there's a lot of value in there that we can see being on and from the continent that others can't. So we should really make that first move to demonstrate confidence in our own industry. So thank you for that. I see Gerald there, the Chief Investment Officer of the National Social Security Fund of Uganda. Gerald, do you want to make a comment?
Okay, thank you, Hubert, and the rest of the group. I've been interestingly following the discussion. I came in a bit late, but then maybe just to add my voice to what has been discussed before. What we are seeing is something which is unprecedented. We are living in very abnormal times. Of course, there are risks and opportunities for investors like ourselves. What I've been seeing on my end here in Uganda has been a situation whereby, okay, we have a lockdown like so many countries have. Basically, we did a lockdown like so many countries have. But then what it's going to do is that it's going to impact the economy of the country, in which case there has been a lot of debate on the role of institutional investors, specifically a pension fund like ourselves. One of the burning things has been maybe to consider a payout of say 10 or 20% of the member fund. Obviously, that one impacts on the structure of the scheme, which would make it unfortunate. But then, if there's one thing you can learn from this, you know, these are desperate times. But then, like I said, it presents opportunities for investors. I think the idea of looking at sectors like healthcare and pharmacy is interesting. The idea of looking at innovation and digital platforms is just exciting. But again, the most important thing these particular times is liquidity. We believe that our role as a pension fund is to provide that liquidity when it actually dries up. One of the things that characterizes African markets is such that whenever there is a shock of this nature, we tend to see foreigners leaving our markets. Now you need that one pool of funds which is there to act as a shock absorber. Of course, and then the other thing again to notice that our governments are constrained on the fiscal side in terms of what they can do. Even on the monetary side, our central bank's balance sheets are extremely weak, or even we do not have enough reserves. What this means for us is that we need to look at new ways of offering, that is, as pension funds or institutional investors.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
Our countries. One of the controversial things in Uganda, for instance, we tend to be confused for a sovereign wealth fund. Yeah, we are not in the business of stabilizing the exchange rates. We are not in the business of trying to support or to invest in sectors or industries that do not make economic return, but rather provide social benefits in the wider scheme of things. So I think this is a time for so many players to actually relook at the entire financial system, because what I've been seeing in so many countries is that the entire financial system has been looked at in a fragmented way. And I think this is when it requires leaders to actually look at how the different bits and parts of the financial system actually connect. And if there's a collaboration of even a regional nature, so much the better.
Thank you, Gerald. You've touched on key points we were trying to address in the beginning, so we understand the need to coordinate. We've seen a lockdown that's happened globally. Everyone's coordinated it, and we see that it's making, from the epidemiological standpoint, it's helping to flatten the curve. then we understand, and I think it's become through very clearly on this call, the importance of co-investing and really being able to use our expertise as investors and recognizing that there is going to be deficits of capital and liquidity in the market. And through co-investing and investing in each other's markets around key critical sectors, which everyone has identified as infrastructure, care, and those with an ESG dynamic and dimension, is certainly going to be a great opportunity. So I think we've got some very concrete suggestions and recommendations. I'd like to propose that we convene, as Linda has mentioned, again shortly. I'll circulate something and see if we can find a date and time that works for everybody, and we can still an agenda around some of these key recommendations. Similar to Solomon, I think you hit the nail on the head. Let's drive digitization. If the Ghana Infrastructure Investment is going to be one of the anchor investors, let's put a co-investment approach to that. Gerald, to your point, I think you're talking about key concrete opportunities. Let's, as the constituency, put whatever we can on the table in opportunities in our own markets or where we have expertise, both from the policy standpoint and the transaction standpoint, and see if we can make a clear contribution to the fight, not only about the crisis today, but building the economies that we want for tomorrow. I think with that said, ladies and gentlemen, again, I'd like to thank you for your time and participation. We've gone over, but it just goes to show your commitment and passion for the subject that we are dealing with, and you can count on us, as I believe I can count on each of you, for us to make a market contribution. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your days. This formally closes the roundtable. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.